Ever since ChatGPT captured the imagination of the general public around 2022, generative AI has been a hot topic. The idea of a chatbot that can generate human like responses to regular text prompts has exposed a large audience to the idea of artificial intelligence. This technology works by training software to find patterns in data and then using those patterns to generate new data. A chatbot like ChatGPT is trained on an enormous data set of text, and then based on what it learns from that, it can generate new text. Similar technology can be trained on images, which would allow it to generate new images based on a prompt. That's the idea behind something like DALL-E. So it shouldn't be surprising that generative AI can be trained on source code as well. GitHub, which is a platform for hosting and sharing code, used this idea to create a tool called GitHub Copilot. GitHub Copilot is available as a plugin for several different IDEs, and we're going to look at how it works with Visual Studio Code. It acts as an assistant as you program, suggesting completions for your code right in the editor as you work or through an integrated chatbot interface. This is still a pretty new addition to VS Code, and it's in active development, so hopefully this video continues to be helpful as the tool evolves. For example, as I'm recording this, I saw a message this morning that they've added a new feature called Copilot Agent to the preview version of the extension. But hopefully, the basic idea of how we use GitHub Copilot stays pretty much the same. First, we'll need to make sure we have the GitHub Copilot extension installed. If you have installed VS Code recently, you might have been prompted to install it already. If so, you'll see a Copilot icon at the top of the window. If not, you can find it in the Extensions view by searching for GitHub Copilot. It installs like any other extension, and you might need to restart VS Code to get it working. If we click that icon at the top of the window, we'll open the Copilot sidebar. You'll need to sign into your GitHub account to use it, so if you don't have one of those, you'll need to create it. And as part of that process, it'll kick you over to your web browser to log in and authorize access from VS Code. Once you're logged in and connected, you'll get bounced back over to code, and you'll be all set. Copilot does work on a subscription model, but you can use it for free for a limited number of completions per day, and you don't need to enter any payment information to get started. If you go through GitHub's process to join their student developer pack, I believe you'll get a higher limit. So how does it work? Let's go ahead and create a new file, and we'll call it copilotfun.java. I'll create my class header. And already you can start to see how it works. Copilot is predicting what I might want to type next, and it's offering that as a completion, just like the autocomplete feature that's built into VS Code. But instead of just predicting based on the language syntax and keywords, Copilot is predicting based on the context of the code I've already written. It's suggesting a whole new program here, essentially a hello Copilot, which I guess is because I named the file copilotfun.java. To accept the suggestion, I can hit Tab. To ignore the suggestion, I just keep typing. I could actually hit Escape to dismiss it, but it's pretty pushy and it'll keep on suggesting completions as I type. That part takes a little getting used to, and I sometimes find that it slows me down because I get distracted looking through the suggestions and trying to decide if it's helpful or not. For another quick example of how it works, let's just move outside of the main method and start typing a new method. Again, it's constantly suggesting code it thinks I might want, and it gets refined as I keep typing. Once I put the method name sum, it assumes I want a method that takes two integers and adds them together, so it suggests that code, and I'll just accept that suggestion. That's basically how the code complete part of the tool works. Until you try it, it doesn't seem much different than the regular autocomplete, but it's actually pretty impressive. And it works on comments too. If I put my cursor right above this sum method and start a multi-line comment, it'll suggest some text for me that explains the method. And if I move down to the end of a line of code and start a comment, it'll try to explain that line of code. Now, what happens if I move up to the top of the file and I start my usual comment block? The initial suggestion isn't really that great, but it is a nice start. I'll just add on that it calculates the sum of two integers. But here's something I think is pretty cool. My annoying coding teacher is always bugging me to add test cases in my comment block, and I never want to do it. But when I start to type out test cases, Copilot jumps in and offers to help. And I can just keep hitting tab and it'll accept that and go to the next line, and it'll keep suggesting test cases for me. Part of why I think this is so interesting is that the format I use for my test cases really isn't a standard format. It's not something I made up, but it's also not something I ever really see regular people using. It's really specific to my class. But Copilot recognizes that I'm starting a list of test cases, and it understands my format right away. Now, I do have to say that the test cases Copilot suggests are often not really that great. In a simple program like this, there's not much to it, but on a more complex program, the test cases can be pretty weak. I like to test edge cases and unusual inputs, and Copilot doesn't really pick up on that. But it is a good starting point. There are a couple other ways to use Copilot in VS Code, especially if you're not a fan of the constant suggestions. If you click that Copilot icon at the top of the window, you can open the chat panel. This is now more like a chatbot interface where we can type in a prompt and get a suggestion back. I'm going to ask it to write a method that takes a temperature in Fahrenheit and calculates the equivalent in Celsius. It shows me the code it's come up with, and now if I want to accept that, I can click the Apply button right here. It makes those changes to my file and even highlights everything so I know exactly what it's done. And it even commented the code so that annoying professor won't give me a hard time. If I want that chatbot experience in a more integrated way, I can press Command-I or Control-I on Windows to open the chat interface. I can type in my prompt and it'll give me a suggestion right there in the editor. I still use natural language to describe what I want, but I don't have to have that big panel open on the side taking up all that space. If we decide we don't want all the completion suggestions, we can toggle that off and on really easily. From that Copilot icon, select Configure Code Completions. The menu gives me two options for disabling this. I can disable it entirely, or just disable it for Java files. I still have the chatbot interface, but I won't be bothered by the constant suggestions while I type. And I can always use the same menu to enable completions again. I do want to take a moment to point out that some web-based AI tools can also come up with source code for you. I tend to use Microsoft's Copilot web interface because I use Bing for my searches, part of my effort to minimize how much I use Google products. But ChatGPT is also a good choice and probably more popular. So I'm going to go to copilot.microsoft.com and I can type in a prompt here. If I use the same prompt as before, it doesn't have the same context. It can't look at the files I have open or the code I've been writing, so it won't necessarily know what kind of code I'm looking for. In this case, it's given me a Python program. So I have to refine my prompt by telling it I need one in Java. And now it's given me a Java program that does the same thing. One of the cool little applications of generative AI for beginners is that you could give it a chunk of code you wrote in one language and ask for a translation to a new language you're trying to learn. Anyway, I could now copy and paste this code into my IDE and work with it just like I had written it myself. So that's a way I can still use generative AI even if I don't have something like the Copilot extension installed or integrated into my editor in some way. Now, there might be a little voice in the back of your head pointing out that Copilot has just solved all your difficulties in your programming class since you can just ask it to write your assignments for you. I've had the same thought, and it's a challenge I don't really know how to handle right now. AI also happens to be pretty good at identifying code that's written by AI, and there are often some markers that make it pretty obvious. Clearly, I have an obligation to penalize students who pass off generated code as their own. It really is the exact same thing as turning in your friend's code, or going to Chegg and getting a solution there. And maybe I've made a big mistake by trying to integrate some of this into my class and showing students how to use it, but I just think the technology is too important to ignore. I can give you the usual teacher lecture about how you won't learn anything from cheating and you're only hurting yourself in the long run. But in this case, it's actually true. Most of the students in my class are people who want to work in software development or some other IT field that will require them to do some programming at some point. So the question isn't whether or not your teacher will catch you using generative AI to cheat. It's whether you can actually do the work you're being asked to do. Or maybe more to the point, can you get through a job interview where you're asked to write some code on a piece of paper or on a plain text editor in front of the hiring manager? And that's eventually going to be what employers will do if they aren't already. So I guess I'm saying that you should use Copilot to help you learn, not to help you cheat. The best advice I can give my students is this. When you're tempted to use generated code, consider an alternative. Ask me for some code instead. I won't just give it to you, of course, but I sincerely want to help. And when you ask questions, I'm often able to figure out what's confusing you and get you on track. I know that asking me isn't as convenient as asking Copilot or ChatGPT, but I really do want to help. Even if you're not my student or you're not my student anymore, you'll probably find that I'm willing to help you out and answer questions. That's really the note I want to end on. I hope you'll start exploring generative AI, but we'll also think about the ethics related to these tools and follow the Spider-Man advice. With great power comes great responsibility. AI is changing the world around us, and some parts of that are problematic. But don't let that stop you from exploring how it can help you learn.